Welcome to the inner sanctum of the audiobook vault. The most powerful person in the room has not spoken yet. They may not speak at all. And while everyone around them is performing, explaining, justifying, and filling the air with the verbal evidence of their own anxiety, the most powerful person is doing something that looks, to the untrained eye, like nothing. They are sitting in a stillness that the room cannot ignore. They are looking at specific people at specific moments with a precision that those people feel in their nervous system before they consciously register it. They are occupying their physical space with a completeness that makes the space around them feel claimed, without a single word of claim having been made. And the people in that room, every one of them, is orienting toward this person with an intensity that no amount of articulate speech from anyone else in the room is generating. You have witnessed this, you have felt the pull of it, and you have almost certainly made the mistake of believing that what you were witnessing was a personality trait, something innate and therefore inaccessible, rather than what it actually is, a precise and learnable set of social weapons that operate below the threshold of conscious resistance because they bypass the verbal processing systems that most social influence attempts engage and speak directly to the ancient social intelligence architecture that governs human hierarchy without the permission of conscious thought. Speech is the newest social influence technology available to human beings. In evolutionary terms, it is a recent addition to a social operating system that was already fully functional before language existed, a system that was reading status, threat, safety, and hierarchy through movement, stillness, proximity, distance, gaze, and the specific quality of silence that different internal states produce. That older system does not defer to the verbal system. It runs in parallel with it, continuously and below conscious awareness, and its outputs frequently override the conclusions of verbal processing in ways that people experience as gut feelings, as inexplicable attraction or repulsion, as the sense that something about a person is not quite right despite everything they have said being entirely reasonable, or as the pull towards someone who has said almost nothing, but whose presence has generated an orientation that the verbal content of the room could not produce. This older system is the target of everything this text will teach. The person who learns to speak its language has access to a channel of social influence that most people do not know exists and therefore cannot defend against, and that operates with an efficiency and a depth that verbal influence cannot match because it does not require the other person's conscious cooperation to land. In every day you pass without understanding these mechanisms, there is someone who understands them and is running them on you without your awareness. In every negotiation where you spoke when you should have been silent, you handed the other party information about your internal state that they used against your interests before you had finished the sentence. In every room where you filled the silence because the silence made you uncomfortable, you broadcast the discomfort to every socially intelligent person present, and they updated their assessment of your status accordingly. In every interaction where your gaze moved away at the wrong moment, you sent a signal about your relationship to social pressure that the person applying the pressure registered and filed. These are not hypothetical losses. They are the actual cost, paid continuously, of operating in social environments without the map that this text provides. This content is not for people who want to be more likable. Likability is a retail social objective, optimized for the approval of the majority, and therefore structurally incompatible with the kind of influence this text develops. This is for people who have decided, with the finality that serious decisions require, to understand how social power actually operates at the level below speech, and to develop the precision tools that operate at that level with the same intentionality that a skilled practitioner brings to any high-stakes technical discipline. If you are comfortable with your current level of social influence and feel no friction when you assess the gap between the impact you have in the rooms you enter and the impact you know you are capable of, close this. But if you sense that there is a level of social precision you have not yet accessed, a level at which you move through social environments with the same calm authority as the figures who generate the pull you have observed and felt, then what follows was constructed specifically for you. The silence that the most powerful people deploy is not the silence of someone who has nothing to say. It is the silence of someone who has assessed that silence will accomplish more than speech, and who has the internal stability to let it work without the anxiety that drives most people to fill it prematurely. The gaze that the most socially precise individuals use is not the gaze of someone staring people down in a confrontation. It is the gaze of someone who has learned to look at specific people at specific moments with a quality of attention that communicates, below the threshold of the recipient's conscious processing, a precise and calibrated message about the power relationship between them. The physical space that the most gravitational presences inhabit is not the space of someone who has deliberately spread themselves to take up more room. It is the space of someone whose relationship with their own physical presence is so settled that the space organizes itself around them rather than around the social conventions that govern most people's use of it. These are not performances. They are the natural behavioral expressions of specific internal states, and the development of those internal states, combined with the precise technical understanding of how silence, gaze, and space function as social weapons in specific contexts against specific social dynamics, is the dual architecture that this text will construct across its 9 sections. The internal state without the technical understanding produces a presence that is powerful but imprecise. The technical understanding without the internal state produces a performance that the social intelligence of the people around you will detect and discount. Both together produce the shadow tactician, the individual whose social influence operates so far below the threshold of conscious resistance that the people being influenced experience its effects as their own feelings, their own assessments, their own freely chosen orientations towards someone who has, in the most literal and technical sense, said almost nothing. Silence is not the absence of communication. This is the foundational reframe that everything else in this section depends on, and it is a reframe that most people intellectually accept and operationally ignore, continuing to treat silence in social contexts as a gap to be filled rather than a tool to be deployed. The gap-filling instinct is not irrational. It is the product of a social conditioning that began in the earliest environments most people moved through. Environments in which silence was associated with awkwardness, with disapproval, with the withdrawal of connection, and in which the verbal filling of silence was rewarded with the resumption of the social warmth that the silence had apparently interrupted. That conditioning is so thoroughly installed in most people's social operating system that the discomfort of silence in a social context is experienced as a genuine physiological event, a low-grade threat response that motivates speech the way that physical discomfort motivates movement, not through conscious decision, but through the automatic activation of a relief-seeking behavior that has been reinforced across thousands of social interactions since childhood. The shadow tactician understands this conditioning not as a personal weakness to be overcome, but as a social mechanism to be leveraged. Every person in any social interaction who is running the gap-filling instinct is a person whose behavior is partially controlled by whoever is most comfortable with silence, because the person most comfortable with silence controls the duration of the silence, which means they control the pressure that the silence generates, which means they control the moment at which the other party's discomfort reaches the threshold that produces speech, and the speech that silence discomfort produces is among the most informationally rich speech available in any social interaction. It is speech that was not planned. It is speech that was generated by the need to relieve a physiological discomfort, rather than by a strategic assessment of what should be communicated. Is speech that frequently contains precisely the information that the speaking party had decided before the silence began not to reveal. The mechanics of silence as a pressure instrument operate through a simple but precisely calibrated dynamic. When a significant statement has been made, when an offer has been placed on the table, when a question has been asked whose answer carries consequence, or when a position has been taken that invites response, the conventional social script calls for a relatively rapid verbal reaction from the party receiving the statement, offer, question, or position. The speed of that reaction is itself a social signal. It communicates that the receiving party was prepared for what arrived, that it did not require significant processing, and, implicitly, that the content was not sufficiently surprising or consequential to disrupt the receiving party's internal equilibrium. A rapid response is the social signal of a party who is not particularly affected by what was just said, and being not particularly affected is a status signal that most people send without understanding that they are sending it. Deliberate silence after a significant communication reverses this signal entirely. It communicates that what was said is being given genuine weight, which simultaneously elevates the status of the content and the person who delivered it, and that the responding party's internal processing operates at a depth that requires more time than the conventional social script allocates. Both of these communications are status elevating for the silent party, but they are secondary to the primary function of the silence, which is the generation of pressure in the party who spoke and is now waiting for a response. That pressure, if the silence is held with sufficient internal calm, will typically produce one of three behaviors in the waiting party, each of which is informationally valuable to the shadow tactician. The first is elaboration. The speaking party, unable to tolerate the ambiguity of not knowing how their communication was received, adds information they had not originally planned to add, frequently information that reveals the limits of their position or the anxiety underlying their confidence. The second is concession. The speaking party, interpreting the silence as dissatisfaction or resistance, moves their position toward the silent party without any explicit pressure having been applied. The third is a request for response. The speaking party explicitly asks the silent party's reaction, which is itself a social power, a moment in which the party who spoke first is now explicitly placing themselves in the position of waiting for the other party's assessment. The internal state required to hold silence with sufficient calm to generate these effects is the same internal state that the previous book in this series described in the context of magnetic leadership and genuine structural independence from the social pressure that silence creates. The person who holds silence because they have decided to hold it, but who is internally experiencing the same discomfort as the waiting party. Person waiting for them to speak will leak that discomfort through microsignals that the other party's social intelligence system will detect, and the detection will neutralize the pressure effect because it reveals that the silence is costing the silent party as much as it is costing the waiting party. Genuine silence as a social weapon requires genuine comfort with silence as an internal state, and that comfort is developed through the same practice of deliberate exposure to social pressure without behavioral capitulation that builds every other component of shadow tactical capability. The three categories of silence that the shadow tactician deploys are distinct in their function and their application, and understanding the difference between them is the technical knowledge that transforms silence from a blunt instrument into a precision tool. The first category is evaluative silence, the silence that follows a significant communication and communicates that genuine assessment is occurring. Its function is the generation of the elaboration and concession behaviors described above, and its application is broadest, appropriate in negotiations, in high-stakes conversations, in any interaction where the other party has made a move whose implications you want them to fully inhabit before you respond. The second category is pressure silence, the silence that follows a specific request, demand, or challenge, and that communicates without a single word that the request, demand, or challenge has not produced the intended effect. Its function is the neutralization of social pressure attempts by demonstrating that the pressure is not reaching your emotional system, and its application is most precise in confrontational or challenging social dynamics, where a verbal response would engage with the content of the challenge on its own terms, and thereby validate the challenger's premise that their challenge warranted engagement. Dominance silence is the most sophisticated of the three silence categories and the most consequential in group social contexts because its effects are not contained within a single dyadic interaction, but radiate outward through the entire social field of the group, reshaping the status assessments of every person present simultaneously. To understand how dominance silence operates in groups, it is necessary to first understand the specific social function that speech performs in group contexts, and why the person who speaks least in a group is frequently the person whose speech carries most weight when it finally arrives. In any group conversation, speech serves multiple simultaneous functions, only one of which is the communication of information. It also serves as a continuous signal of the speaker's internal state, their level of social anxiety, their need for the group's attention and validation, their assessment of their own status relative to the other person's, group members, and their relationship to the social pressure that group dynamics generate. Every time someone speaks in a group context, they are broadcasting all of these signals simultaneously, alongside whatever informational content their words contain. And the group's social intelligence system is processing all of them in parallel, continuously updating its collective status map of who in the group is operating from what internal position. The person who speaks frequently in group contexts is therefore continuously providing the group with data about their internal state, and the specific internal states that frequent speech most commonly reveals are the states that most reduce perceived status: the need for attention, the anxiety that silence produces, the desire for validation, and the social monitoring that produces speech calibrated to the group's approval preferences rather than to the speaker's own assessment of what is true and what is worth saying. None of these revelations are intentional. They are the automatic byproduct of speech generated by the gap-filling instinct and the approval dependency loop, and they are read by the socially intelligent members of any group with a precision that the speaker would find disturbing if they were aware of it. Dominance silence in group contexts works by withholding this data entirely. The person who speaks rarely in a group provides the group with almost no information about their internal state through speech, which means the group's social intelligence system must form its status assessment of this person through other channels, primarily through the nonverbal signals of stillness, gaze, and physical presence that will be addressed in subsequent sections. When those nonverbal signals are congruent with high internal status, the absence of speech amplifies rather than undermines the status signal, because the group interprets the silence not as the absence of something to say, but as the deliberate withholding of contribution by someone whose internal state does not require the group's attention to remain stable. That interpretation is itself a status elevation because it attributes to the silent person exactly the quality of approval independence that the previous book identified as the foundational component of magnetic authority. The amplification effect of dominance silence on eventual speech is the most practically significant consequence of this dynamic. When a person who has been silent throughout a group conversation speaks, the group's attention reorganizes toward them with a speed and completeness that the most frequent speaker in the room cannot command, regardless of how eloquent their contributions have been. This reorganization is not a conscious decision. It is the automatic response of social intelligence systems that have been building a model of the silent person across the duration of the silence, and that experience the speech as the long-awaited data point that will allow the model to be updated. The speech arrives into a field of heightened attention that the silence itself created, and its impact is therefore disproportionate to its content, in a way that the frequent speaker's contributions, arriving into a field of normalized attention, cannot achieve. The technical application of dominance silence in specific group contexts requires a calibration that prevents the silence from being misread as absence of engagement, rather than deliberate withholding of contribution. The distinction between these two readings is determined almost entirely by the quality of the nonverbal engagement that accompanies the silence, which is why dominant silence cannot be isolated from the gaze and physical presence components of the shadow tactical system and must be understood as one element of an integrated nonverbal presence rather than as a standalone technique. A person who is silent and visibly disengaged, whose gaze wanders, whose body language signals distraction or discomfort, is not deploying dominant silence. They are simply absent, and the group reads their absence accurately and discounts their eventual contribution accordingly. The person deploying genuine dominant silence is more visibly engaged with the group's conversation than most of the people contributing to it. Their attention more focused, their processing more visibly active, their presence more fully directed toward what is happening in the room. The silence is the absence of verbal output, not the absence of engagement, and that distinction is what the group's social intelligence system reads and responds to with the status elevation that dominance silence is designed to produce. The timing of the eventual contribution, when dominant silence has been deployed across a significant portion of a group conversation, is as consequential as the content of the contribution itself. The shadow tactician does not break their silence at the moment that a contribution first becomes available, because the value of the silence is partially a function of its duration, and breaking it prematurely for a contribution that is merely adequate surrenders the amplification effect for insufficient return. The contribution that breaks dominant silence should be the most precisely formulated, most consequentially timed, and most directionally significant statement that the conversation has made available across its entire duration, because it arrives into the field of maximum attention that the silence has built, and must justify the attention it receives with content that the group cannot dismiss or move past without genuine engagement. A weak contribution after extended dominant silence is more damaging to perceived status than no silence at all, because it reveals that the silence was not the product of the depth that dominant silence is supposed to signal, but simply the absence of anything worth saying, and that revelation retroactively reframes the entire silent period as vacancy rather than deliberate restraint. Gaze is the most ancient social weapon in the human behavioral arsenal, predating language by millions of years and operating through neural pathways that are so deeply wired into the social processing architecture that their activation is involuntary, immediate, and resistant to the kind of conscious override that more recently evolved cognitive systems are capable of. When someone looks at you with a specific quality of attention, you feel it before you register it. Your nervous system responds to it before your conscious mind has processed what is happening. Your status assessment of the person looking at you updates before you have made any deliberate decision to update it. This involuntary, pre-conscious quality of gaze processing is precisely what makes it the most powerful and the most direct of the shadow tactical weapons, because it reaches the target's social intelligence system through a channel that bypasses the conscious filtering that most social influence attempts must pass through before their effects are registered. The popular understanding of gaze as a social tool is almost entirely organized around the concept of eye contact, how much to make, how long to hold it, when to break it, and the general principle that more sustained eye contact communicates more confidence. This understanding is not wrong in the way that false information is wrong. It captures something real about the relationship between gaze behavior and perceived status. But it is incomplete in a way that causes the people who act on it to produce a caricature of the gaze behavior they are attempting to replicate, because the quantity of eye contact is a secondary variable in gaze as a social weapon. The primary variable is the quality of the internal state from which the gaze originates, and that quality is what the recipient's nervous system is actually responding to when it processes the gaze as a social signal. The distinction between gaze that originates from genuine internal authority and gaze that originates from a deliberate attempt to project confidence is detectable by the recipient's social intelligence system through a set of microsignals that accompany the gaze itself. The quality of stillness or tension in the muscles surrounding the eye, the micro movements of the gaze itself within the field of eye contact, the relationship between the gaze and the rest of the face and body, and the specific quality of attention that the gaze conveys, whether it is the attention of someone who is genuinely perceiving the person they are looking at, or the attention of someone who is monitoring the effect of their own gaze on the person they are looking at. That last distinction is the most consequential. The gaze of someone who is monitoring their own effect is a gaze that is partially directed inward, toward the self-assessment that is running in parallel with the social interaction, and that partial inward direction is detectable in the quality of the gaze as a fractional absence. Genuine outward attention that the recipient experiences as something being slightly off without being able to articulate what that something is. The gaze of the shadow tactician is entirely outward. It is the gaze of someone who has resolved the internal monitoring to a sufficient degree that their full attentional capacity is genuinely directed toward the person they are looking at. And the quality of that full outward attention is experienced by the recipient not as being stared at, which is the experience of gaze that originates from social aggression or anxiety, but as being genuinely seen, which is an experience rare enough in most people's social lives that its occurrence generates an immediate and powerful orientation toward the person providing it. This is the gaze dynamic described in the previous book as sovereign emotional presence, and its application as a tactical weapon in the shadow system requires the additional technical understanding of the specific gaze patterns that communicate specific social messages below the threshold of conscious interpretation. The first gaze pattern is what can be precisely described as the assessment gaze, a period of sustained, calm attention directed at a specific person that communicates through its duration and its quality of stillness that a genuine evaluation is occurring. The assessment gaze is not a stare. A stare is distinguished by its quality of challenge, by the tension it carries, and the confrontational dynamic it creates. The assessment gaze carries no challenge. It carries the calm attention of someone who is genuinely processing what they are observing, and its social effect on the recipient is a heightened self-consciousness that the recipient experiences as the awareness of being evaluated by someone whose evaluation matters. That awareness is itself a status signal. It communicates to the recipient's social intelligence system that the person looking at them holds a status position from which evaluation is appropriate, which is the same positional communication that would be produced by a formal authority relationship, but is produced here entirely through the quality of a gaze. The second gaze pattern is the selective acknowledgement gaze, the specific and deliberate direction of sustained attention toward particular individuals in a group context, in a sequence and with a timing that communicates a precise social map of how the shadow tactician is reading the group's significance hierarchy. In any group context, the people toward whom the most powerful person directs their gaze are perceived by the entire group as the people that the most powerful person has assessed as most significant, and that perception elevates the status of those individuals in the group's collective assessment, regardless of any other variable. The shadow tactician uses this dynamic deliberately, directing their gaze toward the individuals whose elevation serves their strategic objectives within the group, and withholding their sustained gaze from the individuals whose status they wish to leave unconfirmed. The selective distribution of gaze attention is one of the most powerful status-shaping tools available in group contexts precisely because it operates entirely non-verbally and therefore cannot be challenged or negotiated through the verbal channels that most status disputes are conducted through. The withdrawal gaze is the most underestimated tool in the shadow tactician's visual arsenal because its social power operates through a mechanism that is the precise inverse of what most people expect. Most people assume that the social power of gaze is located in its direction, in looking at someone with a quality and duration that produces the effects described in the previous section. The withdrawal gaze reveals that the social power of gaze is equally located in its removal, and that the removal of genuine attentional gaze from a person who has become accustomed to receiving it is among the most precisely calibrated social pressure instruments available in any interaction. To understand why, it is necessary to understand what the receipt of genuine attentional gaze does to the recipient's social processing system over the course of an interaction in which it has been consistently provided. When a person has been receiving the full outward attention of someone whose gaze quality communicates genuine internal authority, their social processing system adapts to that attention as a baseline, the same way any sensory system adapts to a sustained stimulus and begins to register its presence as normal rather than as notable. The adaptation happens quickly, within minutes in most interactions, and its consequence is that the attention, while still valued, is no longer consciously registered as significant on a moment-to-moment basis. It has become the expected condition of the interaction. The withdrawal of that attention then operates not as the simple removal of a neutral stimulus, but as a departure from an established baseline that the recipient's social processing system registers immediately, involuntarily, and with a disproportionate intensity relative to what the mere redirection of another person's gaze would seem to warrant. The recipient experiences the withdrawal as a micro-loss, a brief but genuine contraction of social connection that their system motivates them to recover, and the behavior that recovery motivation produces is precisely what the shadow tactician deploys the withdrawal gaze to generate. The recovery behavior takes different forms depending on the recipient's social profile and the specific context of the interaction. In people with high approval dependency, the withdrawal gaze produces immediate behavioral adjustment. They modify whatever they were doing or saying at the moment of the withdrawal in an attempt to recover the attention they have lost, which means the shadow tactician has produced a behavioral change in the other party without a single word of instruction or request. In people with lower approval dependency, gaze produces a more subtle but equally useful effect, a heightened attentiveness to the shadow tactician's subsequent behavior, a closer monitoring of when the attention returns and what conditions preceded its return, which means the recipient has been moved into a state of closer observation of the shadow tactician than they were in before the withdrawal occurred. In group contexts, the selective withdrawal of gaze from a previously acknowledged individual while maintaining it toward others produces a public status demotion that every person in the group registers and updates their own behavior in response to, making the withdrawal gaze one of the most efficient group dynamics management tools in the shadow tactical system. The technical application of the withdrawal gaze requires a precision of timing that distinguishes it from simple inattention. Simple inattention, gaze that wanders because the shadow tactician's attention has genuinely been captured by something else, produces no tactical effect because it carries no signal of deliberate assessment. The withdrawal gaze must be preceded by a sufficient period of engaged attention to establish the baseline that makes the withdrawal significant, and it must be executed at a moment that connects it, in the recipient's processing, with a specific behavior or statement that the shadow tactician wishes to discourage or redirect. The connection does not need to be made explicit. The recipient's social intelligence system will make it automatically, identifying the behavioral antecedent of the attention withdrawal with a precision that conscious analysis could not improve on, and adjusting their behavior accordingly without any awareness that the adjustment was produced by an external instrument rather than by their own internal judgment. Physical space as a social weapon operates through a parallel set of mechanisms rooted in the same ancient social processing architecture that governs gaze processing and equally resistant to conscious override. The study of how human beings use and respond to physical space in social contexts, the field that academic literature calls proxemics, establishes a consistent finding across cultures and contexts. The distance that people maintain from each other in social interactions is not arbitrary or purely a function of practical convenience. It is a continuous social communication, a nonverbal statement about the perceived relationship between the parties, their relative status, their degree of intimacy, and their assessment of the threat or safety that each represents to the other. Every adjustment of physical distance in a social interaction is therefore a social statement, and the shadow tactician makes those statements deliberately and with full understanding of what they communicate. Whose entry by another person produces an immediate and involuntary physiological response, a low-grade activation of the threats or intimacy processing system depending on the identity and perceived intention of the person entering. The personal zone, extending from half a meter to approximately 1.5 meters, is the space of close personal interaction, reserved in most social contexts for people with whom a genuine personal relationship exists. The social zone, from 1.5 to approximately 4 meters, is the space of formal social interaction, professional conversation, and the exchanges between people who know each other but do not have the intimacy that would make the personal zone appropriate. The public zone, beyond 4 meters, is the space of formal address and public performance. The shadow tactician's use of these zones as social weapons is not primarily about the deliberate invasion of others' zones to produce dominance effects, which is a crude application of proxemic knowledge that produces defensiveness and hostility rather than the social influence this text is concerned with generating. It is about the precise management of their own zone, the deliberate control of who is permitted to enter which zone under which conditions, and the specific social communications that those permissions and restrictions produce in the people who experience them. The granting of closer physical access than the social context conventionally warrants is one of the most powerful social bonding instruments available, producing in the recipient an immediate and involuntary sense of elevation, of having been selected for a proximity that others are not being offered. The withholding of that proximity from people who expect it, based on their assessment of the relationship, produces an equally immediate and equally involuntary sense of distance that recalibrates their assessment of where they stand. The integration of silence, gaze, and space into combined tactical deployments is where the shadow system moves from a collection of individual instruments into a unified operational language, and the power of that language emerges from a property that individual instruments do not possess, the property of mutual amplification. When silence, gaze, and space management are deployed simultaneously and congruently, each instrument amplifies the social signal of the others in a way that produces a composite effect that is not the sum of 3 separate influences, but something categorically more powerful, because the congruence across 3 independent nonverbal channels simultaneously creates a social signal of exceptional clarity and force that the recipient's social processing system cannot attribute to coincidence or misread as ambiguous. A single nonverbal signal can be dismissed or misinterpreted. 3 congruent nonverbal signals, arriving simultaneously through 3 independent channels, constitute a social communication that the recipient's system processes with the same certainty and the same immediacy that it processes physical reality. The first integrated tactical combination is what can be described as the convergence hold, the simultaneous deployment of evaluative silence, assessment gaze, and a specific spatial positioning that places the shadow tactician at the precise distance from the target that maximizes the social pressure of the combined signal without crossing into the intimacy zone that would change the nature of the communication from evaluative to confrontational. The convergence hold is deployed in response to a significant communication from the other party, an offer, a position, a claim, or a request, and its function is the production of the maximum elaboration and concession pressure that the shadow system can generate in a dyadic interaction. The silence generates the gap-filling pressure. The assessment gaze generates the awareness of being genuinely evaluated by someone whose evaluation carries weight. The spatial positioning maintains a proximity that prevents the other party from creating physical distance as a relief from the combined pressure. Together, these three instruments create a social environment in which the other party's discomfort with the unresolved interaction reaches its maximum intensity most rapidly, and the behavioral response to that discomfort, elaboration, or concession occurs before the other party has had sufficient time to make a conscious strategic assessment of whether that response serves their interests. The second integrated combination is the selective engagement sequence, a precisely choreographed pattern of gaze direction, spatial movement, and verbal silence that communicates, in a group context, a specific and detailed social map of how the shadow tactician is assessing the relative significance of the different individuals present. The sequence begins with a period of dominance silence, during which the shadow tactician's gaze moves deliberately and unhurriedly across the group, pausing at each person for a duration that communicates a specific level of attention. Longer pauses for the individuals the shadow tactician wishes to elevate, briefer or absent pauses for those whose status is being left unconfirmed. The spatial component of the sequence involves the shadow tactician's body orientation, the direction of their physical attention, which follows the gaze pattern and amplifies its social communication by adding a second channel of directional attention that the group reads as congruent confirmation of the status map being communicated through gaze alone. The silence throughout ensures that no verbal signal is available to the group that might complicate or contradict the nonverbal social map being drawn, leaving the group's social intelligence systems to process the nonverbal communication without interference with verbal content that would engage their conscious processing and reduce the directness of the nonverbal signal's impact. The third integrated combination is the authority reset, a tactical sequence deployed when the shadow tactician's social authority within a group or dyadic interaction has been challenged, reduced, or allowed to erode through a period of conventional social engagement that did not maintain the nonverbal discipline of the shadow system. The authority reset does not respond to the challenge directly because direct response to a status challenge engages with the challenge on its own terms and thereby validates the premise that the challenge warranted a response. Instead, it operates through a sudden shift in the nonverbal register of the shadow tactician's behavior, a transition from whatever level of social engagement preceded the challenge into a complete stillness that is simultaneous across all three channels: silence replacing speech, gaze becoming fully still and directed with complete precision, spatial positioning becoming deliberate and unhurried. The suddenness of this shift across all three channels simultaneously creates a social discontinuity that the group or the other challenging party cannot process as a normal continuation of the interaction. It reads as a change in the fundamental nature of what is happening, as if the social reality of the room has just recalibrated around a different center of gravity, and that recalibration is the authority reset's actual function, the re-establishment of the shadow tactician as the social anchor of the interaction, without any verbal claim to that position having been made. The timing of the authority reset is as critical as its execution, because a reset deployed too quickly after a status challenge reads as defensive reactivity, which is itself a status-reducing signal, and a reset deployed too late after the challenge has been allowed to consolidate into an accepted new status reality faces a social resistance that makes its execution significantly more costly. The optimal moment is the brief window immediately after the challenge has been made and before the group or the other party has had sufficient time to update their collective status assessment in response to it, the moment when the social reality is still fluid and a sufficiently powerful nonverbal intervention can redirect it before it solidifies around the challenger's preferred configuration. The movement dimension of the shadow tactical system, the specific ways in which the shadow tactician moves through physical space, the pace, the economy, and the deliberateness of physical movement as nonverbal status signals, integrates with the stillness of the silence and gaze weapons to produce the full physical presence component of the system. Movement that is rapid communicates urgency, which communicates that the moving party is responding to external demands rather than operating from internal authority. Movement that is economical and unhurried communicates the opposite, that the moving party's pace is determined by their own internal rhythm, rather than by the pressures of the environment, which is the precise physical expression of the approval independence that underlies the entire shadow tactical system. Advanced application of the shadow tactical system requires the development of a diagnostic capability that precedes deployment, the ability to read the specific nonverbal profile of the social environment and the individuals within it with sufficient accuracy to select the tactical combination that will be most effective against the particular configuration of social dynamics present. The same tactical combination that produces maximum pressure in one social environment may produce minimal effect or active resistance in another, not because the underlying mechanisms are different, but because the specific vulnerabilities and resistances of different social profiles require different points of entry. The shadow tactician who has mastered the instruments, but not the diagnostic, is a skilled musician who cannot read the room, capable of producing technically precise performances that land with the wrong emotional register because the situational reading that would have selected the correct piece was absent. The diagnostic begins with the identification of the primary social driver operating in the target individual or group. Every person in every social context is operating from a primary motivational orientation that shapes their processing of social signals more than any other single variable. And the most consequential distinction for shadow tactical deployment is between people whose primary social driver is status seeking and people whose primary social driver is connection seeking. Status-seeking individuals are most responsive to the gaze and space weapons because their social processing is most sensitively calibrated to the status communications those weapons carry. The assessment gaze from someone they perceive as holding higher status produces in them an immediate and powerful orientation toward that person because their social intelligence system is continuously scanning for exactly that signal and responds to its receipt with the full attentional and behavioral resources that their status-seeking orientation has developed. The convergence hold is maximally effective against status-seeking individuals in negotiation contexts, precisely because their status sensitivity makes the combined pressure of evaluative silence, assessment gaze, and controlled proximity land with an intensity that would not be produced in a person whose primary social driver was organized around different priorities. Connection-seeking individuals are most responsive to the sovereign emotional presence component of the shadow system, the quality of full outward attention that was described in the previous book as the rarest and most valuable social gift that one person can offer another. For connection-seeking individuals, the receipt of genuine, full attention is a social event of significant emotional weight, and the shadow tactician who provides it deliberately and then withdraws it through the withdrawal gaze has access to a pressure instrument of considerable force in interactions with this profile, because the loss of genuine connection is experienced by connection-seeking individuals as a more acute social pain than the statist emotion that the withdrawal gaze produces in status-seeking individuals. The tactical implication is that the withdrawal gaze should be deployed earlier and more briefly against connection-seeking individuals than against status-seeking ones, because the threshold at which the withdrawal produces the desired behavioral response is lower, and holding the withdrawal beyond that threshold risks generating defensive withdrawal rather than recovery-motivated behavioral adjustment. High-stakes scenarios require specific adaptations of the integrated combinations that account for the elevated social monitoring that high-stakes contexts produce in all participants. When the stakes of an interaction are genuinely high, the conscious processing capacity that participants direct towards social signal interpretation increases significantly, which means that tactical deployments that rely primarily on the speed of nonverbal processing to bypass conscious evaluation are partially exposed to the slower but more analytical conscious processing that high-stakes attention activates. The adaptation required is an increase in the naturalness and the apparent spontaneity of the tactical deployments, a reduction in the visibility of their deliberateness that prevents the conscious processing of the other party from identifying them as instruments rather than as the natural expressions of the shadow tactician's internal state. This is the adaptation that most clearly reveals the distinction between the shadow tactician who has fully internalized the system and the one who is still consciously deploying it as a technique, because internalized tactics are indistinguishable from natural behavior, while consciously deployed techniques carry the micro-signals of management that high-stakes attention detects with precision. The negotiation context is the high-stakes scenario in which the shadow tactical system produces its most documentable and most consequential effects, because negotiations are structured interactions in which the movements of power, concession, and information are directly connected to outcomes that can be measured in concrete terms. The shadow tactician entering a negotiation has a specific pre-interaction preparation that sets the conditions for maximum tactical effectiveness before the first word is exchanged. This preparation involves the deliberate establishment of the spatial configuration of the interaction, the positioning of themselves and the other party in the physical space that will maximize the effectiveness of the space management weapons, and the pre-commitment to a specific opening silence duration that will be held regardless of the social pressure that the opening moments of the negotiation generate. Both of these preparations are made before the other party arrives, during the brief window in the interaction, which the shadow tactician has uncontested control of the physical and temporal parameters of the interaction. The opening silence of a negotiation, held for a duration that exceeds the social comfort threshold of most negotiators, immediately establishes the asymmetry of silence tolerance that will govern the entire interaction. The other party, arriving with their own nervous system activated by the stakes of the negotiation and their own gap-filling instinct primed by the social pressure of the high-stakes context, experiences the opening silence as an immediate test of their own internal stability, and most negotiators fail that test within the first 30 seconds by filling the silence with preliminary social speech that reveals, through its content and its speed, the level of their social anxiety and the degree to which the stakes of the interaction have activated their approval dependency systems. The shadow tactician receives this information without producing any equivalent disclosure, and the information asymmetry established in those first 30 seconds frequently determines the outcome of the negotiation before its substantive content has been addressed. The defensive dimension of the shadow tactical system is not a separate discipline from the offensive one. It is the same knowledge applied from the receiving end of the weapons rather than the deploying end. And the development of genuine defensive capability is inseparable from the development of genuine offensive capability, because both require the same foundational skill, the ability to identify nonverbal social instruments as instruments, rather than experiencing the effects as if those effects were spontaneous features of the social environment. Most people who are subject to shadow tactical deployments experience the effects without identifying the cause. They feel the pressure of a sustained silence and experience it as their own discomfort, rather than as a deliberately generated social condition. They feel the pull of an assessment gaze and experience it as their own orientation toward a significant person, rather than as the product of a precisely deployed visual weapon. They feel the social demotion of a withdrawal gaze and experience it as a genuine shift in their relationship with the person who withdrew their attention, rather than as a tactical instrument being used to produce a specific behavioral response. The invisibility of the weapons to their targets is the primary source of their power, and the development of the ability to see them is therefore the foundational defensive capability from which all specific counter-deployments follow. The identification of shadow tactical weapons in real time requires a specific cognitive orientation that most people do not maintain in social interactions, because it requires a degree of meta-awareness, the simultaneous observation of the social interaction and of your own processing of it, that is cognitively expensive and that most people's social training has not developed. The default mode of social processing is immersive. You are inside the interaction, experiencing its social reality as if it were objective, responding to its signals as if they were features of the environment, rather than communications from another party who is making choices about what to communicate and how. That question, asked consistently and honestly across the full range of social feelings that any significant interaction generates, will identify the presence of shadow tactical weapons with a reliability that no other diagnostic method matches, because the feelings that shadow weapons produce have a specific quality that distinguishes them from feelings that arise naturally from the situation. They are disproportionate. The pressure of a convergence hold feels more intense than the content of the interaction warrants. The orientation toward a person deploying an assessment gaze feels more compelling than the person's actual communication would justify. The social pain of a withdrawal gaze feels more acute than the mere redirection of another person's attention should produce. These disproportions are the signature of instruments that are amplifying naturally occurring social responses through deliberate deployment, and recognizing the disproportion is the first step in the defensive response. The specific counter-deployments available once a shadow tactical weapon has been identified follow from the understanding of what each weapon requires from the target to produce its effect. Every shadow weapon requires the target's unconscious cooperation to function at full power, the cooperation of a social processing system that is responding to the weapon's signals as if they were features of the social environment rather than deliberate communications. Withdrawing that cooperation, even partially, significantly reduces the weapon's effectiveness, and the withdrawal is achieved not through the suppression of the natural response the weapon is designed to produce, but through the conscious reframing of that response as information rather than as social reality. The discomfort of a sustained silence, once identified as the produced effect of a deliberate instrument, becomes data about the other party's tactical sophistication rather than an experience that motivates gap-filling speech. The reframing does not eliminate the discomfort. It changes its destination from the behavioral adjustment system to the analytical system, which is the same destination shift described in the previous book in the context of resolving the approval dependency loop. The counter-deployment against evaluative silence is the deployment of counter-silence, matching the other party's silence with your own, not as a competitive withholding, but as the genuine expression of a comfort with silence that equals or exceeds theirs. This counter-deployment neutralizes the pressure asymmetry that evaluative silence depends on, because the pressure is generated by the gap between the shadow tactician's silence tolerance and the target's silence discomfort. And eliminating that gap eliminates the pressure. The counter-deployment against the assessment gaze is not the avoidance of eye contact, which would confirm the social hierarchy that the assessment gaze is attempting to establish, but the return of a gaze of equivalent quality, calm, fully outward, and carrying the same signal of genuine internal stability that makes the assessment gaze effective in the first place. Gaze meeting gaze at equivalent quality produces not a confrontation, but a mutual recognition, a social moment in which both parties register that the other is operating from a position of genuine internal authority, and that mutual recognition typically produces a recalibration of the interaction toward a more genuinely equal dynamic than the shadow tactician's initial deployment intended to establish. The counter-deployment against space management weapons requires the most physical courage of the three, because it involves the deliberate maintenance of spatial positioning that the social pressure of the interaction is motivating you to change. When a convergence hold is being deployed against you, the instinctive response is to create distance, to move away from the proximity that is amplifying the pressure of the combined silence and gaze. Resisting that instinct and maintaining your spatial position neutralizes the space management component of the convergence hold without requiring any verbal acknowledgement of what is happening, and the maintenance of your position in the face of the combined pressure communicates through the same nonverbal channels that the convergence hold is using, a signal of internal stability that begins to reverse the status communication the convergence hold was designed to produce. The ultimate defensive capability of the shadow system is not the mastery of specific counter-deployments, but the development of the same internal foundation that makes the offensive weapons effective in the first place, the settled self-possession that makes social pressure instruments lose their leverage because the internal state they are designed to disturb is genuinely stable. A person who has developed that foundation is not immune to shadow tactical weapons. They are simply a significantly less productive target for them because the gap between their silence tolerance and the weapon's pressure, the gap between their gaze stability and the weapon's visual force, the gap between their spatial comfort and the weapon's proxemic pressure is narrow enough that the weapons must be deployed with extraordinary precision to produce any significant effect, and most people who deploy shadow tactical weapons, human life, the friendships, the family bonds, the romantic partnerships that provide the connection and the genuine mutual knowledge that no tactical system can substitute for, are relationships that the shadow tactical system should inform but not govern. To bring the full tactical apparatus of silence management, gaze deployment, and space control into a relationship that is supposed to be organized around genuine mutual vulnerability and genuine mutual knowledge is to replace the relationship with a performance of it. And the performance, however technically skilled, produces none of the actual goods that the relationship is supposed to provide. The shadow tactician who has developed genuine internal architecture knows this without being told, because the settled self-possession that the system is built on is itself the product of a person who has resolved the approval dependency and the social anxiety that make tactical management of intimate relationships feel necessary. The person who needs to deploy tactical instruments in their intimate relationships is the person who has not yet developed the internal foundation that makes genuine intimacy safe. And the development of that foundation is the work that this text's sister volumes have addressed in the context of magnetic leadership and sovereign identity. The shadow tactical system is the outer expression of an internal development. It is most powerful, most precise, and most ethically sound in the hands of a person who has done that internal development, and it is most dangerous, most crude, and most likely to produce outcomes that damage both the deployer and the people they interact with in the hands of a person who has acquired the tactical knowledge without the internal foundation that gives it its correct orientation. You now possess the map of the shadow language, the silence that creates pressure, the gaze that shapes hierarchies, the space that communicates authority, the integrated combinations that produce social effects of a precision and a depth that verbal influence cannot approach. What you do with this map is the question that only your own values and your own judgment can answer. Use it in the service of outcomes that you would be willing to defend in full transparency, and you hold one of the most sophisticated social instruments available to a human being operating in complex social environments. Use it otherwise, and you will eventually discover what every skilled manipulator discovers, that the non-conscious channels through which these weapons operate run in both directions, and the person who uses precision instruments without ethical grounding eventually becomes the most precisely targeted victim of the system they thought they were running. The shadow is yours. What you project from it determines everything.